Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on our webinar about climate resilience, land use, and housing policies. I'm really excited about our lineup today. Just to introduce myself, my name is Cara Lee Brown. I am the Assistant Executive Director at the Institute for Local Government. I'm also a member of the ICARP Board of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. I'm a technical advisory member, and I'm very excited to bring you today's presentation. Next slide. We will be meeting for about an hour and a half today. We'll go over some welcome and some logistics. We'll talk a little bit about where we are today in climate and housing policies. And then we'll have presentations from three fabulous speakers. The first is Eric DeCock. He is the Deputy Director for Planning and Community Development at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Eric leads the team's efforts on policy development and planning guidance for local and regional efforts there that further the state's planning priorities and climate goals. Eric also has 20 years of experience in both public, private, and nonprofits, having worked for Ascent Environmental as well as the City of Sacramento before coming to OPR. And then next, we'll be hearing from Sonoma County Supervisor James Gore. Supervisor Gore is currently the president of the California State Association of Counties and serves on many boards and committees for the National Association of Counties, including the Resilient Communities Advisory Board. During his time in office, Mr. Gore has experienced more than a dozen natural disasters in his county and will share some of those lessons learned and experiences with us today. And last but certainly not least, we will hear from Eric Nelson. Mr. Nelson is currently the Vice President of Community Development at Trumark Homes and the Chairman of the Planning Commission at the City of Dana Point. He has a background in land use planning, entitlement processing, and development that spans over 2 decades. So Eric participates on several boards and committees as well, including the Environmental Quality Committee for the League of Cities. And so following those presentations, we'll have a panel discussion. We'll do a little Q&A. We'll hear from you, the audience, and then we'll tell you about some more resources that will help you on this topic. Next slide. I just want to go over a little logistics for this. You are all on mute. We're going to keep you on mute for the duration of the call, but we will offer you an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to type any of those questions into the questions box anytime during the webinar. We will collect them throughout and we will ask them during the Q&A period. And that is what I will do. Go ahead, next slide. Just to tell you a little bit about ILG and why we're putting on this webinar, we are the nonprofit and training education affiliate of both CSAC, California Special Districts Association, and the League of California Cities. We aim to really provide that kind of practical and easy to use resources. We want to share best practices and lessons learned on a variety of topics. Next slide. We do focus on several key areas. One is leadership and governance. The next is civics, education, and workforce development. We also do a lot in public engagement, as well as sustainable and resilient communities. And we do that by hosting convenings, educational webinars such as today. And really our mission is to help local government leaders kind of navigate that complexity and increased resilience capacity and build trust in their communities. Next slide. We are also proud to be part of the statewide technical assistance team that is led by HCD and the PlaceWorks team. We provide statewide and regional technical assistance. We are currently also updating our flagship resource, the Planning Commissioner's Handbook. In 2022, we will be doing trainings, free trainings throughout the state around that. And then we also have this local leader training series. We have done 6 of the webinars in the series, and we have 2 more, and I'll tell you about those later on in this presentation. Next slide. And so without further ado, we're going to get to our presenters. We're going to go ahead and start with Eric DeCock, followed by James Gore, and then go to Eric Nelson. Next slide. Great, and go ahead and take it away, Eric.
Right, thanks so much. Thank you so much, Carolee, and great to be here. Thanks for inviting me in. Thanks to also everyone out there for attending. Excited to have you in the room today to talk about climate resilient land use and housing policy. Next slide, please. I get the pleasure, also the pain of a bit of describing where we're at today in California and how it all, relates back to the topic at hand today, which is really about land use and housing and resilience. Certainly we are balancing, competing, often what are framed as competing crises, but I'm going to talk about how I don't think these crises are necessarily in competition, that we need to address them all concurrently and in a way that's aligned and in a way that really moves us towards a more livable and resilient California and more livable and resilient communities and places to live at the end of the day. We certainly don't need to go into the deep weeds of how climate change is impacting our state, how the pandemic is impacting our state and our communities. We just have interrelated crises that are really exposing that we have a growing set of hazards and risks with a compounding set of challenges around public health that's exposed by the pandemic, and who is bearing these hazards and risks and crises the most, but our frontline communities, those who are most vulnerable, right? And so that's who we have in mind front and foremost as we think about these challenges, whether we're talking about climate or housing. We really, the growing realization for many at the state level, and I think in most community levels as well, is that we can no longer really plan and build as if the disasters or the crises that we're experiencing, their impacts, are always going to be the same or generally the same as history. Things are happening now to us that have never happened before in recorded history. And we need to really think that through and think about how to adapt and become more resilient in the face of these challenges. And so, of course, we'll get into the weeds a bit more about what OPR has done and the resources that are out there to support that, but I just want to make that clear, and I think a lot of us get that today. We also have, of course, a housing crisis. All the data and everything about the trends analysis, our needs, shows that we just need to build a lot more of it in all of our communities. But of course, it's not the same housing needs as that we've had in the past. We know that we have diverse populations with changing needs. The current pandemic and a lot of our crises show us that the housing we've built in the past doesn't necessarily meet the needs of the today and tomorrow. And so we need to think about where and how to add more housing and who are we providing housing for in a much more constrained and less predictable future. Of course, the state has done a lot of work around regulatory streamlining, looking at new funding mechanisms, making it as easy as we can to build more housing. And we've made a lot of progress, but we still have obviously a lot more work to do. The numbers are improving now, but we're still not close to where we need to be to have the annual production numbers to meet our targets. And we're acutely aware of that, and we're working at all levels. And I think the scale of the crisis we're talking about it's not just the state's problem. It is every level of government in California, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, everyone working together to move the needle to make sure that we are clearing barriers and finding innovative and cost-effective ways to build housing while also respect the growing crises in front of us. Next slide, please. So what does this look like? So what does it look like to kind of look at all these converging crises together and think about how to move forward in sort of a climate resilient way? When we're thinking about land use, we're thinking about housing. Obviously, the challenges in front of us, whether we're talking about wildfire, a pandemic, sea level rise, extreme heat, we're really talking about transforming how we grow and manage change in our communities and really balancing a complex array of issues and community needs. Definitely, as I mentioned earlier, prioritizing the needs of our most vulnerable populations as we're planning and building, but even thinking about increasing our community's capacity for who's on the ground today or might be coming into our communities in the future. And that looks like how we best prepare for challenges and disasters, how do we respond in those instances, and then how do we recover, follow the times when a disaster or a crisis comes to our communities. We do recognize that the growth patterns of the past, the way we've done things, haven't always been the best. And so we need to think about what are those systems in place now, who's vulnerable, and how do we really retrofit communities, increase capacity, address liabilities on the ground. There's a lot of need there. I also want to talk about planning. I'm a planner, trained as a planner, 20 plus years in the field. But what we're starting to know, and a lot of the veteran planners get this, it's not just about good planning. What we really need is effective implementation. So what does that look like? Well, at the highest decision-making level, it's that political will to follow through on the great plans. We can write a great adaptation plan as a community. We can write a great local hazard mitigation plan, but it really doesn't mean a lot if we're not willing to follow through and make those investments and make the structural changes in our systems, in our decision making, and all the way down through to implementation on the ground to make sure that happens. And of course, that again requires a lot of partnership and coordination across lines and sectors. We need to make sure there's adequate resources in place for all the different levels of planning all the way through to implementation, and even also reevaluating and monitoring how effective are our results on the ground. And last but not least, I just did want to highlight too, obviously there's a great deal of flexibility we need to think about as we see growing crises and converging and things seem to be getting worse. Things are changing fast. And so we need to keep an open mind and keep reevaluating what's effective now, but what needs to change given what we're currently experiencing, and how do we change things moving forward. Before I hand off the mic to the next speaker, I just want to quickly go through a few slides that I prepared. I won't spend a lot of time. Next slide, please. That we do have planning principles in place today in the state planning priorities that really do emphasize how we intend to promote equity, protect our economy, strengthen it, and protect our environment, and also thinking about health and safety. The California planning priorities are really all about making it easier to do infill development in already developed areas. We need to think about protecting and conserving our natural working lands, but last but not least, we know that not every development need is in an infill area. So when we do grow outside of infill areas, what does that look like? How do we be as efficient as possible and minimize ongoing costs to taxpayers, especially thinking about climate adaptation and resilience moving forward? So the last few slides on my slide deck, I'm not going to speak to them in detail. We do have a lot of changes in the law recently. Next slide, please, on the general plan elements. If I had a whole nother half an hour, we could go through all the changes that have been made. Next slide, please. Especially on the safety element, there have been a number of statutory changes. We have a lot of guidance out there. I'm not going to go into detail. We have incentives through the AB 2140 program for aligning a local hazard mitigation plan with the safety element. There's a very strong post-disaster recovery incentive if you do that. So we're always available if you need some help to talk with OPR and Cal OES both. And then just the last few slides, next slide, please, really start to get into all the guidance that we have, whether it's our general plan guidelines, the fire hazard planning technical advisory, very recently updated. We have our adaptation planning resources. Next slide, please. And then last but not least, next slide, is a few slides that speak to funding resources that are out there for communities. I don't think it made it into the slide deck, but we do have a lot of lists of funding resources available for planning to look at adaptation and resilience and healthy and safe communities, as well as implementation resources, how to fund implementation. A lot of budget moves were made over the last few months in terms of this current fiscal year. And we currently have a very large $3.7 billion climate resiliency package that is pending in the legislature, which hopefully the next time I'm on an ILG webinar, I can give you some good news about some very cool new programs that are coming and approved. So anyway, with that, happy to hand this off to the next speaker, and thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric. I know that was a lot to go over in a short amount of time. Do not worry, we will be diving into a lot of those resources and new legislation later on. But right now I did want to go to James Gore, who has been experienced a lot of the unfortunate events that we had that have affect both the climate resilience of our communities and housing in the county of Sonoma. Supervisor Gore?
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And, it's an interesting story to look at from a statewide basis. I'm the president of the California State Association of Counties, and so I look at it also from the aspect of 58 counties, coastal counties, inland counties, mountain counties up in the Sierras and everything. But the story that starts with what we're looking at is these disasters and the impact of those disruptions on what we're doing. But at the same time, it's to remind ourselves of where we are in California, in our counties and our cities. When general plans were initially created, and if you look back at the history of it, the goal was pretty clear. It was to make sure that we focused on infill in developed areas, and it was to protect against urban sprawl and its impact on our natural resources in other areas. And one of the things that we continue to find in my community, just like any community everywhere, is that those infill areas, it's exceedingly still difficult. There's tons of planning commission issues, and a lot of people who don't want more housing built. They don't want housing to go up higher. And oftentimes perfect is the enemy of the good. We know it's difficult that all of these things to create safe and affordable housing at the same time sometimes can be at conflict, it looks like, because to make something safe, you have to make it more, have good planning associated with it. You have to hit codes, you have to do all these other things. So where did the subsidies come? But what I want to talk about outside of the challenge is the opportunity. And to start with that, I want to talk about our experience in Sonoma County. You know, I was elected in 2014, November of 2014, at the end of a historic drought. In that last water year, 2013, the calendar year of it, it was the driest year in the history of Sonoma County, on recorded history, excuse me. On the other side, you know, we flash forward and have flash floods and have fires and all these other things. And so at this point, the words historic and unprecedented have become precedent, and non-historic. They've become commonplace. So looking at this, it's less about the trial by fire and it's more about the trial by fire, flooding and drought, climate change, this cycle of more extreme weather and how it is changing our landscape and how we are changing based on that. So real quickly, you can see before you, you know, drought in 2014, then immediately following flash flooding, an early fire season announced, the massive valley fire right on our perimeter. Even with that, we weren't woke to the point that we took crazy action, high wind and flooding, another wildfire in September of 2016. Next slide, please. Then from there, you know, continual from the driest year in recorded history of Sonoma County to the wettest year in the recorded history in Sonoma County. Santa Rosa breaks rainfall record, another day of breaking heat. This is not a story that's unique to us. You all know that these words, historic, unprecedented, first time ever, have become commonplace. And then when we move forward and we look at the difference of the Sonoma complex fires in October of 2017, where we actually lost 7,000 buildings and 5,300 of those homes, not just in the WUI, not just in the wild urban interface, but directly into residential areas, Coffee Park, some people know about. In my district, you know, it was a shock that it had come all the way in and devastated that. The Kincaid fire in 2019 and all of the other floods and the Walbridge fire and others, even though it's difficult to look at how those disruptions affected us, the other thing I want to state is that the difference between the 2017 fires and the 2019 fires in Kincaid, we do call that a tale of two fires. It was a success story. The Kincaid fire was the largest fire in Sonoma County history. And I hate to say this, but it was only 300 homes that we lost. I say 300 because I know those people. I grew up with them. It was in Alexander Valley in the hills. Came from a great grown family myself. A lot of those folks I know well. But at the same time, we had rapidly adapted in those short 2 years to get to the point where we had a new system. We had tested alert and warnings. We'd done Sonoma Ready Day. We'd really focused heavily on waking people up. We'd done organizing with citizen groups and adapted our entire system and our emergency response. And so what that meant is that by the time this fire came, we were able to evacuate 40% of our population in a few days, allow our firefighters and our first responders to do the work that was needed on the ground. And they were able to fight a fire as the embers came into those communities of Hillsburg and Windsor and stop them before they became huge conflagrations, instead of having those same individuals in 2017, when all of us were caught on our heels, helping people evacuate, knocking on doors, saving people's animals, doing all these other things. So that created a new disruption, which was the evacuation disruption. You know, we all know how that can be, especially for individuals in our most underserved populations that have trouble making ends meet and live really hand to mouth. So when you evacuate 40% of your population, you see those impacts as well. Yeah, you see spoiled food. You see salaries drop out without unemployment. So you see all this disruption really moves forward. Next slide, please. Into a place where you just have to take advantage of the disruption and move. We know that this is not just happening in Sonoma County and throughout California. This is happening all around the US. Multi-billion weather and climate events. Before the pandemic and before this latest round of 2021, a full third of all the counties in the nation had experienced a presidential disaster declaration sometime in the past 3 to 4 years. Those are crazy numbers. Next slide, please. These are extremely expensive, extremely hard to manage, but at the same time, the point I really want to make here is not about what happens and when you get smacked on the face, but really the word resilience, which is when you get hit, how do you respond? Do you come back stronger? Do you just try to get back to where you were, which is really kind of a myth, let's say that. And then, or also, do you just keep getting wounded and feel like a wounded community? So, you know, the stuff that I've talked about, alert and warnings, vegetation management, community preparedness, next slide, please. All of this stuff is all about taking advantage of the moment. And whether you're from the side of Rahm Emanuel, who says never waste a crisis, or Dick Cheney, who says never waste a crisis, you have to use the focus to be able to get things done. So the emergency management and the emergency operations center, the hazard mitigation grants, the 50 million we just got in the building resilient infrastructure and communities from FEMA, all of this stuff shows an ability to move forward, to activate, to turn the work of just getting people more prepared into actual mitigation and climate change adaptation. Next slide. Sonoma County has a long history of this. This is just a few things just to throw your way. You know, you're looking at announcements of everyday initiatives. Carbon-free water, something we've achieved. Office of Recovery and Resiliency with a Recovery and Resiliency framework. Drought awareness campaigns. Weather balloons. We have first in the nation forecast-informed reservoir operations program that has finally broke up the system of the Army Corps of Engineers just managing their reservoirs off of old maps and basically charts that show, you know, from 1968 when you should dump water. All of this work needs to be accelerated. We all know that, but we are taking action. Community choice aggregation, our roadmap to resilience, and the activation of our community around that. Good stuff. So what I'm going to leave with is not talk about all these disruptions and climate and how we respond, but just quickly about housing. So when we lost those 5,300 homes in 2017, let's say a full 2,000 of them were really in kind of a residential urban area in a city of Santa Rosa. The rest of them were still in the wild urban interface. And one of the stories is about 1,300 of those homes were lost on Mark West Springs Road. Mark West Springs Road, it was basically the blowtorch of this fire, but also the blowtorch of a similar fire in 1964 called the Hanley Fire. That fire in 1964 and before zoning really went into effect in the late 70s and early 80s in Sonoma County, basically cleared the way for huge land use development in that area. So ironically, a fire from 1964 laid the groundwork for a community that was burnt down in 2017. Now, those homes are being rebuilt. Those are entitled homes. This is one of the stories of an inability to really kind of go back on land use. You know, these are all entitled buildings. People can rebuild. The biggest thing we can do is make sure that they rebuild in a fire hardened way, right? That they meet standards, that we support them to use less water when they're rebuilt, to be more resilient to fire, to be more resilient to everything. But the big thing that I want to state is that we took it upon ourselves to really attack the issue of housing. We went through all 10 general plans in Sonoma County, the counties and the 9 cities, and we identified the 50,000 homes that are in those general plans already approved under having gone full CEQA evaluation and review that are not built yet in Sonoma County. Now, to tell you the truth, those all have, some of those are 2030, 2040 general plans, but we really looked at that and we looked at how many homes are entitled but not built. We started to reach out. We created a joint powers authority called the Renewal Enterprise District. That's a primary partnership between Santa Rosa and Sonoma County as a joint powers authority. We're trying to bring on the other cities into that to basically put the funding in, and we've put $20 million from our PG&E settlement dollars between us and the city of Santa Rosa and others to prioritize those areas that are entitled but not built, and also the other general plan build out policies that we can support. Back to what I said in the initial, The covenant in California is the way we build housing, is we go back to the areas that are developed and we do our best to make sure that those plans and those entitled areas actually have the opportunity to be built. And then we protect through the resilient work that we've shown in other places, the other side of the coin, the natural and wild lands. We are still in that process. We are neck deep in it. We are putting money, staff, everything towards it. And these disruptions, they keep on coming, but we're going to roll with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. So much to think about there. And, our thoughts and prayers go out to your community and those who are experiencing wildfire right now. Thank you to all the emergency personnel who's out there, and take care for all of those who are evacuated.
I'm sorry for the background noise. I had somebody come in and out, and I had to do the whole.
Oh, that's okay.
Thank you.
I do want to make one quick announcement, is that we are recording the session, and we will be sending out the PowerPoint deck as well as the recording to everyone who registered for this. Thank you all for being here. And I do want to go next to Eric Nelson, who's going to talk a little bit more about the development side and how things are going in his community of Dana Point.
Thank you so much, Carolee. It's an honor to be here and be amongst some really interesting and really experienced speakers today. Next slide. I am a local. I grew up in Orange County, and if you know Dana Point, you probably know some of these pictures. And I like to refer to this slide as the "we don't do this anymore" slide. Our Dana Point was heavily built in the 1960s to 1989. Over 75% of our housing stock was built. And you could see the impact of that when you look to the left on the top two slides, or the two slides to the left. The good old days of building on the beach, and then you look at that bottom slide and you see the end result, just 7 or 8 years post that. And those homes, by the way, were built in the 60s, or some of them were. And next slide, please. And one more slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the coastline and some of the impacts of, and real impacts of the sea level rise related to climate change, and how we've had to respond as a city. And Mr. Gore spoke about it earlier on. We have entitled homes, and so the reality is we can't tell them no anymore, especially if they want to rebuild. But we can do things very much like they're doing in Santa Rosa and in Sonoma County, that ensure that new construction is done in a way that is specifically addressing the issues that are hitting our coastline now relative to sea level rise, flooding, and the impacts that are felt by those projects. And you can see here, this is an area of town, we call it Beach Road. This is one of our beaches. It's a public beach and a public parking lot. And this is an image from 2003. However, it was built in the 70s. So it is an older area of our beach. And in 2003, you can see we have a parking lot, a restroom, a basketball court. There's also a boardwalk in an area where people can walk back and forth, and the public has access to the coast. Next slide, please. But things quickly change on the coast. And within 7 or 8 years, what you see here is an attempt to protect not only the parking lot, but if you were to move sort of south in the imagery, you'll also see this is an attempt with rocks and other measures to stop the impact of wave action due to sea level rise. Next slide. And this is 2021, and you can really see additional attempts here to try to stop the real issue here, which is that the water is coming in and it's hitting man-made structures. And one thing I've learned, and I think as a city we've learned, and most people realize this, is Mother Nature is almost impossible to stop. You can potentially do things to be more resilient or adapt to Mother Nature, but you certainly cannot stop it. And what we've learned over the years is that in the attempt at stopping Mother Nature, specifically related to wave action and high tides, is that we end up creating additional problems down the coast. And so one of the things that it's certainly up in the air, but I certainly would agree is probably part of the problem is this area had a much larger beach and much more sand prior to the development of the harbor, which is just to the north of this image. And by creating those barriers, we've altered our coastline in such a way that areas along this part of town were never built to address those. They were built long before a harbor, and the results are pretty clear. Next slide. And in this slide, what you'll see is what we've already lost as a city. So we've lost part of our parking lot, which is in blue. We've lost the restroom. We've lost the basketball court. These have all ended up in the ocean. And you could see in the different colors a number of the years of where the wave action has been. And it's clear it's moving into the built environment of our coast. And we, as a city, have started to do some significant things, very specifically here on Beach Road, next slide, and implemented a floodplain management program that is, the intent here really is to make sure that we allow for homeowners to build on their property. However, they're not allowed to build them the way we used to. And the way we used to build is they would put a slab on grade on the sand and a home right on top of that. And as we've seen in the other images, and one of the earlier images I showed where the water was actually crashing into the homes happened 3 weeks ago. And so these are real issues that we are dealing with today, where homes are being, they haven't been washed out to sea yet, but I think time is not on their side, and it will be inevitable. But the policy that we enacted as a city is a policy that ensures that new construction is built in a way that it can adapt not only to the impact of the tidal movement, but also the impact of sea level rise. And you can see it here. We require that they build their entire home up above the base flood elevation, which is established through a wave run-up process. And I'm not a scientist, but I'm certainly been part of the implementation of this and the approval of several houses along Beach Road. And then these homes are set on caissons. So at any point, the water will be able to move underneath the home and through the garage. There are kick-out panels or breakaway panels that allow for wave action and water movement to go back and forth. The one interesting thing, and again, I think Mr. Gore spoke to it, is we do have challenges implementing these policies, not only from the perspective of homeowners having rights and the ability to build, but also the homes that are already there. And the little box that you see in the upper right is just a quick snapshot of one of the, I wouldn't call it challenges, but I would call it, it's really just an implication of this. And that is that when we require homes to be built this way, they end up being, at least 7 feet higher than the existing homes around them. And that, obviously creates challenges for the public. I, for one, don't think it's something that should ever stop a project, but it's one that we have to think through. We also have to think through the impact of a house coming loose that hasn't been properly built, and what are the impacts of a home that's being destroyed on the coast, and what types of damage does it do to the other homes, as well as our environment. The ocean was never intended to have homes in it or the debris that comes from wave action. And so this policy also includes maximum rebuilding requirements, as well as limitations on renovations. So we do not allow, we offer one major renovation over the life cycle of the home in this area, as well as only a 10% per year renovation, or not renovation, but maintenance clause. And the real truth of that is we have to discourage the idea that we can continue to keep these homes that aren't built above our floodplain in place. And I think, I always think about it from a different perspective. I think about cars, and it would be I know for me, I would not drive a car that was built in 1960s, certainly as a commuter. There are a lot of things that have changed over the years. We don't smoke on airplanes anymore. We don't use leaded gas, and we have to start thinking critically about how we build in the future. And again, those all have implications. Next slide, please. I know there's been a lot of talk about fire, and I know I've got a limited amount of time, but I do want to jump onto a few things that we were talked about today. I think this is a critical issue, obviously, as we look at what's happening in Northern California, specifically near Lake Tahoe right now today. And Down here in Southern California, more specifically in Orange County, our interface, the urban interface, is slightly different than the types of interfaces that you may see in Sonoma County or other parts of Northern California. We have more of a desert type coastal area, and we're mainly built out. So we're not building in the middle of high fire zones anymore. We're now building along edges or nearby. And next slide, please. There are some really great policies that have come down. And I want to say somewhere around 2014, we really saw the implementation of a lot of these policies, everything from the new 7A building codes to creating defensible space, brush clearing, vegetation management, how we address transmission lines, and really, next slide, looking at property and fire behavior all at the same time. This slide here you can see is a slide that shows fire modeling as it relates to a project that was proposed that's still being reviewed. And what you see here is that the types of construction and the type of edge condition that's been designed on this project allow for the fire to move around the project as opposed to moving through it. And this is where science becomes really important, and not only using science, but making decisions based on science. Because we have a housing crisis. As a home builder, I could tell you it's an important thing to address these types of issues, but I also hesitate at times to think about policy and how policy may impact housing development, and it has to be done in a way that is thoughtful, is collaborative, because I think when you look at issues like fire, many cities don't have their own fire department. In fact, a lot of counties rely on CAL FIRE, and so these are complex issues. Complexity creates time, it creates costs, but these are all important issues. Next slide, please. And so, in my slide deck, I left a few things. There's a link at the bottom, just some additional information for those that are looking at resilient policies relative to building near or around high fire zones. These have clearly worked. I can tell you that in Orange County, the last 4 or 5 big fires that were anywhere near the built environment, if they burned anywhere near homes that were built after 2014, we lost, I think, 1 home in 4 or 5 fires in Orange County that burned up to or near the existing built environment. And that's because these homes are not only resilient, but they're built in a manner that addresses the real issue of proximity of fire, using everything from ember protection to the things we talked about earlier: brush clearing, hillside grading restrictions, heat deflection walls, as well as fuel mod zones and building height limitations. So there's a lot of stuff there, but I look forward to questions and chatting more with the audience. And with that, I think that's all I've got.
Thanks so much, Eric. I'm going to ask all of our panelists to join us back on camera for a Q&A session, if you don't mind. And I'm just going to go ahead and begin. So as some of you alluded in your presentations, we have so many competing plans and priorities in California. We heard about the climate crisis and the housing crisis. We've heard about homeowners' rights versus community benefits. So I'm wondering if, many communities right now are really trying to balance that need to accommodate more housing with actions to make their existing homes and infrastructure kind of more resilient to climate impacts. So I'm wondering if each of you can talk a little bit about how that manifests in your world and offer some solutions about how communities might approach this. So I'm wondering if we can go ahead and start with Eric Nelson and then hear from Eric DeCock and then Supervisor Gore. Oh, Eric.
There we go. Okay, sorry, I had to get my mute button back. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's a broad question. I could go a lot of different ways, but I think what I'd like to suggest to the audience is that one of the things that they keep in mind is working closely with the other agencies. So this sort of intra-agency component, as things get more complex and more agencies get involved, that complexity can result in challenges down the road. And as a home builder, part of the biggest factor that we look at is the sense of surety that what we have as an approval is an approval that we can build with. And so if you think about the housing crisis from the renter or the buyer's perspective, the competition to buy a house or rent is relatively high right now. It's probably at its peak. It's a different crisis than we had in 08. But one thing to think about is that as a home builder, the same competition exists. So what it takes for my company to obtain a project, purchase a project from a landowner is super competitive, which means our ability to make money, frankly, is limited. And so every little thing impacts the bottom line. And while the bottom line is a discussion a lot of people don't want to look at, public home building and even production home building, we have very low profit margins. You know, usually the property owner is the one who makes most of the money, and we build it at a, you know, we make good money, but we don't make a lot of money. And again, I don't want to belabor this, but I think it's an important component when I go back to this idea of intra-agency and complexity. And I'll give you one snapshot of an example that we're currently dealing with now. We have a project in a Southern California location. It has gone through an exhaustive CEQA process. It has full approvals, a development agreement, and unfortunately, due to the complexity of the approvals, which included some mitigation measures relative to the biology and replacement of some trees, the complexity was such that the owners that processed it didn't realize that one of their mitigation measures was impossible. And it was impossible because we're in a high fire zone. So there's a requirement to replace a bunch of trees, which is appropriate. However, when you're next to a high, or in a severe high fire zone, it's impossible to plant as many trees as you may want to. And so that project will now be stalled out for at least a year. It's going to have to go back through, do a supplemental EIR, all because somebody missed this. And so this is where the interagency discussion comes into play, and the level of expertise that the consultants that do these projects really, I would just implore that they work closely together and make sure that everybody's looking at not only conditions, but mitigation measures to ensure that projects can actually get built, and they can get built safely and responsibly. So those are probably would be the thing that I would talk about most, and the things that affect home builders today, as well as my own community personally.
Thanks so much, Eric. Eric DeCock, same question to you. You know, what are you kind of seeing as those disconnects and different approaches that folks can take?
Yeah, absolutely. By just building what Eric just said, I think, you know, I think when we are asked, you know, as the state's planning agency to kind of take the broad statewide perspective and look at what does the law say people should be doing in their planning and in their implementation, right? How does this all actually work with these new mandates, and what are people figuring out? Well, I think there's a two-part question. One is that there's already so much liability and risk now. Even if we were to build nothing new today in California, we have a lot to fix. So we start there, retrofitting communities, right? So many homes in our wildland urban interface and our flood zones they're not ready for when disaster strikes. So even though we tend to think of planning as just what's new, a lot of what's in our plans needs to address both existing and new moving forward. So, you know, when we updated, let's say, our fire hazard technical advisories, we really put a lot of work into balancing and really helping communities think holistically about how to be fire adapted and resilient for the next time an event occurs. And so I think that's a big part of it. And we're seeing, you know, a lot of advancements in creative financing, you know, pairing, planning, higher standards, and then financing at the aggregate scale. You know, how do you finance advanced mitigation and vegetation management? How do you get defensible space implemented on so that almost everyone is doing it rather than maybe a 15 or 20% participation rate? We need to see results that are effective and better funded. So I think there's a lot of creativity going into that. We're also working with the insurance industry to really figure out, is there a feasibility of introducing performance-based pricing to really think about it, incentivizing that participation, right? Along with all the direct investments we could do through grants and state and federal monies, as well as local monies. So I think there's a lot that we're working towards at the state level to try to drive that readiness. And when we think about the new development space, obviously, you know, in a lot of the policy conversations right now, people tend to talk about the WUI as it's one specific uniform condition. And that's just not true. Or that this flood zone over here is the same all over California. Well, that's just not true. The reality is that for some communities, they have choices about where to grow, where to increase density, where to place new land uses. And for others, they're 100% in a hazard area. And it's kind of silly to say they're going to completely avoid those hazards. So we need nuanced policy. I think, speaking back to someone else, that we need regulations and policies and guidance that's flexible and recognizes that every community is a little bit different. And so recognizing that some communities need to do infill in the WUI, but for some communities, they have a lot of choice in the matter. And so avoidance policy combined with risk minimization, a mix of tools, creating open space buffers, managing those open spaces better. There's a lot of tools on the table that at folks' disposal. And I'm talking a lot about wildfire because I think it's on all of our minds, but a lot of these principles apply broadly to a lot of our climate-induced hazards or climate-exacerbated hazards and risks. So I think it's that mix of strategies, knowing that there's a lot of diversity in this state. And so we're very mindful of that as we move forward and, thinking about new policy and changing guidance.
Yeah, thanks for that. Supervisor Gore, same question to you. I know, some communities are grappling with high RENAs right now. How do you really, balance the need for homes, affordable homes with, climate resilience? What are you guys doing in Sonoma?
I'm going to hit it from a couple sides. The first thing is that, we have a lot of, because of the danger, there's a lot of focus on the WUI, but I can't save everybody who lives in a dangerous area from themselves. And this kind of leads into maybe another topic that we need to kind of get into maybe with the next question, which is insurance, which is this big, very visible hand, not an invisible hand, that is changing things far more than our policies, our local policies and other things. I mean, these danger areas are finally starting to have drops in policies. And then we have what's going on with the insurance commissioner really not approving small increases in over that are spread throughout multiple communities, because why should high population areas cover the danger areas? You know what I'm talking about, right? This kind of goes into the conversation about PG&E rates and how we subsidize things. So insurance is a big mover in those areas. And while I can provide programs like we are on home hardening incentives through PACE and the increases there, I mean, those are legacy places that we're going to have to work with insurance companies to try and find a way to mitigate risk and have insurance be a true up at some point besides what's going on. So that's a big thing, right? So I'm going to separate that from the internal areas and where we're at. And I'm going to talk a little bit about something that Eric and OPR, that I admire what they've been doing and what we've been doing too, which is a word that came up earlier, which talked about political courage. So from a side of approving projects in appropriate areas, in spite of NIMBYs, because we live in a world where, especially in coastal California, let's just talk about that. Everyone talks about NIMBYs and cave people. We got another one, which is banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody, right? And I just have to call it out that you have to lean in and deal with that. And so what I've seen is a couple different ways. I've seen a lot of locals who have stepped up, including us and our board, and a lot of what I've seen in our cities in Santa Rosa and others. But I've also seen OPR and the governor's office, and in my direct conversation with Gavin Newsom and with everyone else in housing, and putting more pressure on local jurisdictions, which I believe in, that say, if this is in your general plan build out, if these are in your RENA numbers, and if you're going to not approve projects that really fill with what you've committed to, and if you condition those to death through planning commission and other processes, or vote them down, we're going to come down and we're going to put some pressure on you, and we're going to even scare you and say that housing is going to be linked to transportation dollars and all these other things. And so I think that is the necessary strife and conflict that's going on right now, because we have these cultural changes that need to be challenged right now. We have a lot of priority development areas, PDAs, where people still don't think stuff should be built. I still have a huge opposition to building stuff near a new smart train, basically our fast rail line, where people still, well, we shouldn't build there because we need to protect that. I'm like, this is a business park, right? So you've got to have those things. And I think the one thing that people don't realize is that the conversation in the past that used to take this and say, okay, well, we need to go deeper. Instead of fighting every single policy or every single land use project that comes before us, let's figure out a way that we get into something that used to be called by right development. And I'm very thankful that in Sonoma County, in the last general plan update, they made by right development for everything that was basically zoned for affordable housing. Because you know what? Every time there's an affordable housing project that comes up, everyone says, I support affordable housing, but not here. When I can go back to the community members and say, there was a policy passed that said that this can go to design review, but it can't go for a full planning commission hearing. In a way, I would rather have that fight one time as a politician and set those standards than go through that with every project and have everything be a hellish situation where, how dare you? You can't do that. There's not enough water here. There's not enough time here. There's not enough whatever. It's always a reason that you can't build housing. Let's be very real. Okay. So on the other side of that is that by right has kind of a bad name to it. It's, you know, it has more of a schism. I think about Ashley Swearingen out in Fresno, who was leveraging that. So we're even changing the wording. You know, we're talking about it as being ministerial instead of by right. You know what I mean? But like, here's your standards. Here's your standards that you have to achieve. But we're not going to have everything go before a public body. And how do we get there? So I think that pressure from the state is super positive. And I'm a big proponent from a county side of saying, like, local control without local action is an inherent conflict. Other thing I want to say is that it's important we're having this conversation from the third thing I wanted to bring up, and it seems like a weird one, but it is totally relevant. Appropriate telework policies and the future of work being a game changer right now for housing. Okay, so I just want to say that from the demand side of an employer, not a policymaker, of an employer, right now we are going through this guttural thing where maybe our administrator and our HR want to take a more constrained focus on telework, and we're sitting here trying to say, well, some of us, well, maybe we shouldn't just allow 40%. This isn't a pilot. We just, for a year and a half, have moved our entire workforce to virtual. And we have employees, we want to hold accountability for work, but we have employees that aren't on the roads, right? And then we're having to make decisions on, okay, well, if we're going to allow telework, how far do you have to be from your location? If we have an emergency, do you have to be there by 24 hours? Can you be an employee of the county of Sonoma and live in the Central Valley? What a weird thing to think about, right? Is what's going on. So I wanted to call out some of those disruptors that are out there that aren't just in the normal frame of reference. Telework, insurance, you know, big stuff going on. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. Let's build on a little bit of what you just said. You know, we have a question from the audience asking, how will the need to build more resilient communities and housing impact housing affordability? So really honing in on that affordability question. Do you have any suggestions or advice to balance affordability and resiliency? And I think I'll start this with Eric Nelson, but I'm going to give others a chance to chime in. As a developer, how do we build more affordable, but yet make our homes more resilient?
Therein lies, you know, a challenge. I think, you know, from a home builder's perspective, what I would share is that, you know, our industry is really smart. We've made significant changes over the years in the way we build, as well as the methodologies that we use. My company, for instance, builds almost 90% of our homes off-site with panelized wall sections, panelized roofs, and we remove a number of risk issues relative to stockpiling wood, and also increase speed to market. And a lot of this is sort of driven by new policies, you know, internally as a company. We want to be more green as we build homes, and so we buy lumber that's harvested, you know, more like a crop as opposed to buying lumber through deforesting. But I don't think there's a simple way to answer the question. What I will tell you is the sooner we know that as home builders that something's going to change, the easier it is for us to start to develop and react to it. One great example is the net zero policies that came into effect a few years ago with solar requirements. We were ready when those hit. And while it at its initial cost was about $15 a foot addition, you know, we had made significant inroads before the policy actually hit the street, before Title 24 was adopted. And that notice gave us the ability to, you know, build in such a manner that it didn't increase our costs. But I think it is one of the challenges of complexity. is that with complexity, we do have an inherent increase in costs, and there's no way around that. I mean, I think if you look at the homes that were built, you know, the home I live in was built in 1955, and it is in no way anywhere near the homes that we have today. If I built that home today, it would probably cost me half of what it cost me to build homes now. And so I don't know there's an easy answer, but other than making sure, A, that there's flexibility in any policy that has the potential to increase costs, but also that there is the opportunity or a lead time relative to a policy, sort of a you know, a slow but known time frame. We're seeing that now with VMTs. You know, we work most you know, governments work close over the years to try to get that resolved. But I'm going to throw one thing onto that as it relates to affordable housing, because it's one of these policies specific to density bonus that I think is a great policy in writing, but it creates challenges. And James Gore spoke about it. You know, this inability or unwillingness for decision makers to make those tough decisions. And when you look at the way density bonus law is in most cities used, it is effectively an entitlement to use density bonus, which is inherently a problem when you have you know, communities that are not happy with development, and then you show up in their words with loopholes and the other things, you know, associated with using density bonus that are problematic. And I would love to see a policymaker take the position that density bonus is a right, and it's a right that can come post entitlement. And as a builder, I'd be much more likely to use it if I needed it, and as well as if I didn't have to fight the neighbors over this idea that we're going to be bringing in, and I use quotes, 4 people into the neighborhood. We build affordable housing. I just built a 20-plex and closed it out last month. And it's super rewarding to be able to do that. And the one reason that we were able to do it is it wasn't a discretionary action. We were able to do it. We needed some resolution to a few planning issues, setback provisions, and the way we park our cars. And by providing the affordable housing, we got the relief through the density bonus law, and it was after entitlement. And so I think that's one piece where I think there could be a lot of movement, is if we move away from that being an entitlement but a right that any developer could take advantage of, that would then yield more affordable housing by right.
That's great. I know a lot of local governments are exploring various pro-housing policies. I'm going to go back to Eric DeCock. Eric, there has been a ton of policies and requirements and legislation coming out of the state. Can you talk a little bit more? I know we went very quickly through your slides, so I just kind of wanted to slow it down a little bit and talk about 1 or 2 of the major ones, or even how can local governments kind of prioritize these? Because I know it's coming at them all at once, and they're just trying to keep up. Can you offer any advice for them?
Yeah, happy to do that, Carolee. I think that, you know, the evolution of the planning law, especially in the general plan side, we're acutely aware of how quickly the safety elements have been layered on, and just every couple of years for the last 6 years, there's a continual lumping on them more and more. But, you know, I think a lot of that is the legislature's response to the crises we're seeing, right? And so there's to say, yeah, we need to adapt to climate change. Let's put that into our planning. We've learned from recent events that maybe our evacuation planning is not very robust. And yeah, we put a new requirement in the general plan, and there's a lot of other planning that can be leveraged. And so on that point, I think when you read our most recent guidances that have come out, whether it's the fire guidance, the adaptation planning guide, we're starting to recognize that alignment of plans to make sure that each one is leveraging each other's strengths but not duplicating efforts is a top priority. And we've even put some incentives out there as a state to make sure that that happens. So that local hazard mitigation plan safety element nexus, we created a post-disaster mitigation funding incentive that says, hey, if you've amended your local hazard mitigation plan into your safety element, maybe you even set that local hazard mitigation plan up to meet some of the safety element requirements, you don't have to do it twice. In fact, should you do this, if the disaster strikes, you are actually eligible for full state subsidies of your local match for post-disaster monies. And so that's a huge incentive. And we've actually seen some jurisdictions learn the hard way that had they had that in place, they wouldn't have had to shoulder some of those disaster recovery costs for post-disaster things like debris removal and so forth. So this is huge. It's transformative. We work every day with Cal OES to make sure that the messaging is out there and that folks are being advised when they're bringing their local hazard mitigation plans in for a Cal OES review before it goes to FEMA. We've walked them through the safety element incorporation by reference pathway to make sure that that's clear. Here's the documentation you need. So again, it's setting up these plans in a way that set a community up for success, but also provide some incentives on the back end when things don't go quite right. So that's a huge priority for us. Yeah, so anyway, lots of examples like that. If there's anyone ever has very specific questions on how to navigate some of this, we're always happy to pick up the phone and talk. I think another big issue we keep seeing happening too is things keep getting tied to the housing element, right? And so the legislature hasn't given a lot of clarity on, well, it says upon the next housing element update, I have to do these things. Do I have to do that concurrently? Do I have to do that sometime after? There's not a lot of clarity, and we don't always have the best advice. We can't provide legal advice when the statute is super vague. So we're in as much of a bind as many of folks, but our advice is always get it done. HCD is not gonna give you a lot of wiggle room on your housing element, so scope it as far enough in advance as you can. Try to align decision-making on safety and housing. But if you need to follow up your housing element with a safety element update, HCD is not gonna give you a lot of wiggle room there. So think about the appropriate phasing, starting your vulnerability assessments early when you're making site inventory decisions for housing, then back it up with the good safety element, et cetera, after the fact. So it's a little bit of nesting, and some of those overlapping tasks can be really, really helpful in the process.
Thanks so much for that, Eric. I know, local governments always struggle with time, capacity, priorities, phasing things. Money and resources depend on a lot of how they implement climate action plans, how they think about resilience plans, even if they have created a climate resilience plan. I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about the importance of climate action plans and climate resilience plans. Obviously, we have to do general plans in housing, but those other ones aren't mandated. Can you tell about if it's important for communities to do that and why make the investment? I'm going to go ahead and start with James and then go to Eric DeCock real fast.
The general plans and the outlay and what was just discussed in the last item shows how many conflicts there are and how we can say that we need to align them, but they're very difficult. I sat and testified at Congress, sitting next to the head of the builders for the National Builders Association, and then another side of FEMA folks testifying on the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. And one side is saying that you can't increase codes post-destruction for a rebuild area, and the other side is saying, how could we not? How can you rebuild something the same way it was and have repeat areas in these stuff? So the difficult with those conflicts is always going to be there. And I think one of the things is that we do need to make sure, even as a local leader, that we have standards that are statewide standards and other things, because it's difficult to get things done. People get voted out of office for voting for projects. Just so you can have courage, but you'll still get kicked out of office, and then somebody else will come in. So good on you, right? So I'm a believer in that. And then going forward, that linked with what you're talking about with these plans these days, the biggest thing that everybody needs, whether it's an economy, whether it's a housing market and builders or other things, is some kind of a stability, not to just operate within chaos, right? And so I'm sitting here looking at Eric, who is on a planning commission and also a builder, and it's like, when you're looking at an area where the climate extremes and the lack of planning and the lack of mitigation strategies that are on the ground, if you don't have a plan locally that people see as being enacted, they don't have confidence in your community. It's just going to continue to be chaos. So why would they come in and build? Why would they start to build and go through an entitlement process where in the process of like 6 months, the building, the price per square foot is going to go from 250 a square foot to 450, because of all this flux and all these conflicts. So I think the planning that you're talking about, really, it used to be planning per se, and it would get sat on a shelf in your local hazard mitigation plan and other things. But these days, those moving into the BRIC program, moving into resilience efforts, moving into other funding categories, and seeing those actions on the ground are the only way that we're going to be able to get it. So.
Yeah, Eric at DeCock, can you talk a little bit about the need for plannings? I know sometimes it helps get some funding in the door as well if you have kind of a coherent plan. Can you talk a little bit about both climate adaptation and climate action plans versus climate resilience plans and why each are important?
Absolutely. Yeah, strongly encourage, communities to do that local level planning. We start just on the greenhouse gas mitigation side. First of all, it's a great tool to set a framework to address the climate crisis from the upstream, emissions mitigation standpoint. That has so many benefits and can really drive the conversation on how to proactively address that part of the climate crisis. A lot of communities know as well, if you do end up doing a general plan update, you're going to have to do CEQA on the general plan update. And if you haven't had a community-wide conversation about how to mitigate greenhouse gas for your updated general plan, maybe your updated housing element, you can quickly find you don't really have a strategy to mitigate some of those greenhouse gas impacts when you're looking at the CEQA obligation. So it is a helpful tool to look at not just, the proactive, the right thing to do, but it can actually really help to streamline and provide some clear mitigation pathways for the build out of a community. So OPR strongly encourages that. It's in our CEQA guidance, it's in our general plan guidance for sure, but we definitely strongly promote that and are always available to help answer questions about those benefits. On the climate adaptation planning side, that is a requirement now for all cities and counties. It went into effect in 2017. So you can put your vulnerability assessment, your adaptation plan into your safety element. You can also do a separate standalone climate adaptation, incorporate that by reference, just like you could with a hazard mitigation plan, into the safety element. And we do strongly encourage that as well. The law allows for that. But we definitely are seeing a lot of folks, regardless of what SB 379 says, is just doing it because it feels like the right thing to do. And it is a proactive tool to use to have a really good community conversation about how not just to adapt to changing climate, but to look at the needs of vulnerable communities with the climate lens, thinking about how do we create a more equitable and just future for our communities, knowing that not every decision's made on land use, services, open space, community needs have been addressed equitably in the past. And how do we use the climate crisis as a way to really think as a community, how do we adapt to become more resilient, thinking about all of our community's needs together. So I think we are hoping folks kind of thinking, SB 379, but what are the benefits of doing this bigger thing of adaptation planning? And how can we really start to move the needle on not just housing, but climate and equity goals at the same time?
Thanks so much, Eric. Yes, the equity question is just a whole nother, layer to this. I did want to remind folks to continue to put your questions in the question box. That's the only way we're going to get to them as you are all still remaining on mute. One of the questions in the box alludes to, I've heard that the East Coast is buying out some of the endangered properties. Sounds pretty expensive. Do we do that here? Does anyone want to take a stab at that question? I will go ahead and say that I do know that the town of Paradise is in negotiation with many of the residents who were devastated in that fire, talking about whether, they want to rebuild there. They're trying to buy out over 200 residents, I believe it is. And those are ongoing communications right now, just trying to say why rebuild in an obvious wildfire area. We do also have other questions in the box, folks from a tree city and saying they're wondering if it's a good idea considering climate change. So they said, while our legislator considers redistricting housing development in wooded areas, we continue to build an urban forest around our homes. Does anyone want to talk a little bit about, everyone loves trees. Trees have, they sequester carbon. There's a lot of great things to trees, but trees also burn quickly. So any thoughts on that? James, we've lost James. I was going to throw it to him, someone who's really had.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, and Eric, feel free to follow me. I think that we definitely want to promote urban forests where it's appropriate. There are challenges, of course, with rising temperatures, more extreme heat. The reality is that the trees that we've planted in our urban forests to date over the last century and a half haven't always been climate appropriate. So some of them need a ton of water. So we might see transformation of the urban forest to do more climate appropriate species that can provide the shading benefit, provide the carbon sequestering benefit. So we're really encouraging those approaches. You know, OPR and some of our partner agencies are working on an extreme heat platform as part of the state's adaptation strategy update. So there's some work underway around looking at, you know, tree coverage as a extreme heat mitigation tool. And of course, when you're in the WUI, you know, the vegetation, the plantings you do, it's a whole different ball game, right, in terms of what are the right species. So definitely there's some sensitivities there, but you know, definitely we don't want folks to just do any old tree, and there's got to be a way to do this that thinks about climate change is already happening, but also look at the benefits of the shading and the sequestration, things that won't burn down and not use a lot of water.
Great, thank you. You know, we've talked about a lot of things, and I always feel like, you know, it's kind of doom and gloom, but, you know, I wanted to kind of bring us on a more uplifting note. I'm wondering if each of you can share one policy or program that you think is really making a difference. And I'm going to go ahead and start with Supervisor Gore on that one.
So the one program is that when you talk about truly what is a plan and what is an action plan, I would say it's dedicating time and resources and creating an office that deals with this. So after our 27, I wish I could point to one, but what I can point to is that you can talk about this stuff, but until you really deploy people towards it as their first and primary goal, as opposed to it being another ancillary duties as otherwise assigned on top of all these other things in local government, you don't have change. So what we did after 2017 is we created an Office of Recovery and Resiliency. Right, we took from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, basically a plan that they had put together after, I think it was you know, one of many hurricanes, and we created basically a recovery and resiliency framework that, if you looked at it, has 270 actions. It has a top 10 list. We review that continually as our board of supervisors. Our hazard mitigation grant, staff can take that and run and go after things based off it. They don't have to come to our board all the time to do it. Those are the kind of things that have yielded announcements like when President Biden announces $37 million to Sonoma County out of the BRIC program in the first round. It's not just because we went around and played and all these other things. It's because we invested in capacity, we invested in grant writers, we set money aside to go after these things. And then we also are directing our staff right now to do the same thing with the infrastructure bill. You know, what are our shovel-ready projects? But there's also then we're getting involved in the lobbying on that. So the recovery and resiliency framework that we developed, which is really an adaptation plan that is getting huge returns, is the biggest thing I would say. Thank you.
That's great. Eric Nelson, any thoughts on that? The one policy that you think is really making a difference?
Yeah, and I spoke about fire already, so I'll leave that. I think the changes that have already occurred over the years have been really, really good for communities. But one that I like to talk about that is starting to show up more and more, the first time I ever saw it was in Irvine, is this idea that we have to move away from enclosed garages, that, you know, really enclosed spaces for people, and we really don't need to put our cars indoors. They don't need to be protected from the environment, especially California. They can sit outside and they'll be fine. But moreover, that we remove, you know, one of the primary things that creates parking problems, and that's garage doors. And so what Irvine has done, as well as a number of other cities, is they incentivize the removal of garage doors by giving you a parking reduction. And in cities and all developments, you know, parking spaces and places for trash cans and recycling cans and things that are non-human related, and being able to limit my garage doors and reduce my parking requirements has become a really unique and interesting way to deal with one of the big challenges that we hear all the time in communities, and that is that there isn't enough parking. So I think that's a great policy. It's nuanced, but would suggest anybody looking at that to take a look at Irvine's code.
That's great. Thanks so much. Eric DeCock, same question to you. You know a lot of policies. You got to pick one.
Yeah, that's a tough one. You know, I'm going to sidestep the question slightly and talk about tools. It's sort of related to policy. At OPR, we know that a lot of folks are really balancing with this current RENA cycle, where to put all these new allocations and how to set up site inventories coming out of receiving allocations, and thinking about where to place housing with all these growing constraints and competing demands. So what we did is we created a tool called Site Check, and it does allow local planners, any member of the public, planning commissioners, developers, anyone, to use the tool to really look at their communities and look at the optimal sites to site housing that could potentially qualify for CEQA exemptions. So what we did is we parked all data layers that correspond to the mandatory requirements to meet certain exemptions, and we put them in a mapping tool. And you can create heat maps, you can select a parcel and figure out if it meets some of those criteria or not. So we're getting a lot of really positive feedback about that. It is in beta form. We do have version 1.0 in process, and hope to really complete that by the end of the year, where the next big layer to put in there is our VMT layer, because of obviously SB 743 and some of the new requirements around CEQA there, and trying to optimize and showing where you could at least also get less than significant impacts for VMT. But we're really excited about this tool. Like I said, it will be moving into version 1.0 towards the end of the year, early 2022. Just again, tons of positive feedback, and that's the kind of thinking I think we're trying to promote, is streamline, make it easier to do infill. Let's avoid areas with impacts, and/or find ways to build housing in areas that we want to optimize and streamline housing. So that's one way that we can do it. So obviously it's just one tool. It doesn't clear all the financing barriers and all the other barriers that might exist, but we're trying to pick away one by one all the known barriers and there are many, to doing better and more cost-effective infill development in the state. So if anybody wants to take a look at that, it's sitecheck.opr.ca.gov. I'll happy to put that in the chat as well for folks to take a look at. But take a look, send us your feedback. We'd love to keep improving it. Maybe there'll be a 2.0 someday that does even better, bigger and better things for optimizing where we put housing. So thanks.
Thanks so much for that. I know we're getting a lot of questions in the question box. Some are, to specific speakers here, and we're going to try to send those out to you more in a Q&A, if that's okay. I did want to explore, before we go, just kind of one more concept, and this is the concept of partnerships. James, I know that became incredibly important as you guys experienced your tragedies over the years. Can you talk to me a little bit about what partnerships were particularly critical in trying to, create more resilience for your community and try to overcome some of those barriers around housing?
Thing I would start with is from the ground up, is just the work we did on civic engagement and taking the fact that there was so much fear in our community and rallying that around something. So the resilience of your community, we can do all these policies and all these other things, and they can achieve so much, but people have to buy in to what's going on. They have to sign up for home hardening programs. They have to take ownership on veg management on private property. So what we did was, I organized this group called the Block Captains, which was neighborhood leaders to help their communities rebuild, and met with them every week for months and months and years. And then on the other side, help them rebuild. On the other side, I woke up about 6 months after that and just freaking out because I wasn't focusing on the communities that hadn't burnt yet. And so we focus instead with them on COPE, citizen organizations, to prepare for emergencies. COPE is what we call it up here. We have a very dynamic COPE group. There's also CERT, Citizen Emergency Response Teams, right? That is more of a certification. So on one side, it's mobilizing those folks towards the reality that's there, because you can't leave them behind and just pass policies, right? And kind of go and do this. So that partnership with your community and that buy-in has really been the reason that we've been able to change things, because then they're loud with my colleagues or my partners or whoever it is, right? On the other side, you have this whole world, which is, we call it the disaster industrial complex. The minute you have a fire or a flood or something like that, all these people parachute in with all these names and acronyms from the federal and the state and otherwise. And to make sure you turn that from a response into a mitigation in a management standpoint, with hazard mitigation grants, with the BRIC program, with the revamp of your local hazard mitigation plan, with all this stuff that we know needs to be done to get that plan there and mobilizing it. I mean, that's just yielded huge resources. And we've been able to get laws changed, and we've been able to lobby to get allocations increased in programs. And, you know, it's one of the top things for the state right now too with us. And so in the governor's office. And so creating that strength out of chaos has been super awesome. And then in the middle of it, I would just say is that where the part that we are not at yet, and I'm going to switch from resiliency over into housing, is that we continue to have everybody work their butts off to create unique new bonus structures, to create unique new ways to streamline, to do these other things. And you know, the problem is that I still do not see those being linked up with what the business community needs to be able to develop housing. And so at the end of the day, government has been able to do that for things like heavily subsidized affordable housing, like that we fund. You know, we have programs that have, as we all know, that get down to 50 to 70% AMI, and they have to have 20 to 30 different funding partners and other things to get done. But when it comes to straight development, I still feel like the biggest thing that we need to do is we need to go back to basics and really see what it does for something to be able to break ground. Once again, the reason I say that is because we have build out potential in our general plans. We have standards that make it expensive to build. We have all these other things. And then we have needs to get housing for our most vulnerable. And those things still do not line up in a congruent structure. And so I just think it's time to say, here's to what's next. And that's the biggest partnership that I personally and others need to figure out.
Yeah, to that point, Eric Nelson, as a developer, what are you thinking? Partnerships, community engagement. Can you offer your thoughts on those things?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to echo just about everything James just spoke about. I mean, I think the reality for home building is far different than if you want to build a stadium, which is unique in a state that is in such a crisis. But you can get a permit to build a stadium and get, you know, around CEQA, but you can't do that when you're building within the framework that the jurisdiction of the framework, i.e. you already have zoning and stuff. So I think partnering up, you know, not only at a legislative level, I think the biggest challenge I see as a home builder going forward is that there is some thinking that policy will fix everything. What I know is that we're never going to see a reduction in cost in time by adding regulations. Just the two are not, they're not compatible. And I think we have to be thoughtful and careful about what we do as an industry. We try to work closely with our legislators, and I say industry, the Building Industry Association. We try to not pick fights on things that don't impact us at the bottom line or in time, and are good policies. But at the same time, you know, this idea that we can sort of regulate into affordability is one that I have not seen yet, and it's a big challenge because as home builders, you know, I'll speak for myself personally. The best thing for us would be to be able to build for as many people as possible, and not just those who are fortunate enough to be able to pay for expensive housing, but we should be able to build for everybody. And by doing that, that means we have a more robust industry. And we are, I wouldn't say barred from doing that, but it's extremely difficult to build to those lower levels. And James spoke to it, the capital stack that's required to do that is significant because they need to be subsidized. And the subsidization is a result of a number of things, including the cost of land and the regulatory environment. And so there is you know, at the local level, what I always tell, you know, my builder partners and my coworkers is that you know, your cities we're working in are the best place for us to create partnerships. And we've done that in almost every city we've built in, whether it's we've been able to make changes and do some really significant public improvements as part of a project that they really needed done, you know, down to just being part of a community foundation that supports the community's needs. And that's something that we can do as home builders. We can get engaged at a local level because a lot of things happen at the local level, including the permit issuance.
Yeah, I know funding is such a big piece of this, and the partnerships that create funding. I know we've had a lot of questions and statements in the chat box, in the questions box, talking about the many layers of funding that developers have to layer in to get one development built. So thank you so much for that. We are coming up.
Can I add one thing? You have to let me add one thing.
I will.
Eric, as you mentioned, we took, after our fires, a proposal forward, very well developed, to the legislature, to the hearing, and then it was to have what the stadium proposal was for CEQA streamlining to be applied to our priority development areas for our fire rebuild. And the stadium got the votes for the CEQA streamlining, and the priority development areas for housing did not. And that is a case where I say legislatively, that's one thing, but that's the other thing. I look to our other Eric, and that's why folks like Senator Wiener are proposing, by right or ministerial development for areas that are in priority development areas. Is because that stuff still gets voted down. So thank you. I'm sorry to say that, but that shows where we need to go.
Yeah,
Well,
no, I know it's always that push and pull over state mandates and local control.
Let me say that SB 7 was signed by the governor a few months ago. It was an urgency bill, and it did add housing projects to the jobs and economic recovery, or I forget, there's a long name. Let's just call it SB 7, used to be AB 900. It does include housing projects valued at 15 million or more. They do have to meet all the labor provisions as well as the no net increase in GHG standards to qualify for that. But that was an addition in the SB 7.
Yeah, and there's so much coming down, right now, obviously the legislative session is still ongoing, and we're waiting to find out, where certain monies are going and what new bills and laws are going to be passed. We will be addressing that in an upcoming webinar. We do have one before that. Our next webinar in the series is about housing strategies to help address homelessness. And then once everything shakes out, we will do one on new laws and new money coming up. So we hope you all will join us for that. I'd like to go ahead and share some contact information from all of our speakers. Oh, I do have one more resource I wanted to let you know about, and that's the ICARP Clearinghouse. This contains a bunch of great resources on climate resilience. It has case stories. It has different guidance documents and plans and policies on all the different topics. So I definitely encourage you to check that out. It's great. And now I will go ahead and share more information about ILG. You could definitely stay connected with us through Facebook, Twitter. We're at www.ca.ilg.org. And then these are the contact information for all of our speakers today. I certainly want to thank you guys for joining us and hope you'll join us in the rest of the series. And thank you to all my fabulous speakers. Very lucky to get, state, local, and developer contributions to this very complex but important topic. So thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Here.
Thank you. Awesome.